now that we have all of these set up, these are the pieces that we'll have to worry about. We have an idea of what we're going to need to implement for the game. What we see here is a few pieces. We have the bartender. So it's called splorsh here, but we'll just call it bartender for now. We have beer, which we're going to call drink. We've got the tap. We've got the bar. Then we've got all the patrons, as well as the background. The background is just going to kind of be there. It's probably going to stay a sprite, or we're going to make it like a texture in the background. We'll see. But the piece that I want to start working on functionally to get the feel of is the beer. We're just going to start chucking a beer down the bar. And what that's going to require is for the drink to be its own scene. So instead of being a sprite, we're going to first turn this into its own scene. So we'll save this in the scene. We'll have drink.tscn. And now this is its own scene. We can edit it as its own scene. We do want to reset this to be centered here. That's going to we got to remember it's 22 and 170. We're going to reset it to center here so that when we put it into this main scene, it's always at 0, 0 in case we spawn, because we're going to be spawning in more beers, but we don't want the beer to always be in like that offset location. That'd be a little weird because we want to be able to take this scene and drag it or place it wherever we want. So we had that at 220 or 22, 170. That's where that was. What we can do later is we can actually add that as like a spawn point for the beer so that anytime you pour a drink, it spawns in the same location every time. But that'll be later. So let's go back to the drink scene. We can go ahead and zoom in on it. And we're not really going to do a whole lot with this as it is. What we will do is we'll change a few things around. We're going to change the type of this. And it's going to sort of mess up everything. But we're going to change the type to a node 2D. That way we have the baseline of a type of node that has various aspects to it. So in particular, node 2D has things like position, rotation, scale, and skew. A sprite 2D is a type of node 2D. For the purposes of making this drink, we're going to make it a node 2D because it's going to have more things than just a sprite. But it will need a sprite. So I'm going to go in here, right-clicking here. I could also hit the plus there, but I like to right-click, add child node. We're going to add a sprite 2D, or alternatively, we can just go back down to our PNG. There we go. We have our sprite that is a beer. We're back where we were, a little bit more complex. What's nice about it being complex, though, is that we can start to do things with different pieces of it. The parent, node 2D, is going to need to know, okay, how do I do things? How do I know to go flying down the bar? And that's where we add a script. But before we do that, making something fly down the bar, how do we want to do that? Do we want to do that by just completely in the code and tell it, okay, every frame do this, change the values and do all that? Or do we want to just use physics that are built into Godot? And so this is where we, instead of doing a node 2D, I always like to make it a node 2D at first, and then I usually change it. But we're going to make this a different type of node. It's a type of physics node called a rigid body 2D. Rigid body 2Ds are able to have physics materials applied to them, so they can have gravity, friction, all these other things. And so, as well as like constant forces and all of those things. So it really lets you play with a lot of the physics, because what we're going to want to do here is we're going to add an impulse to send it flying. And then we're going to want the bar to have a level of drag to slow it down. So we see this exclamation point up here. It says it has no shape, can't collide or interact with other things. That's not super important right now, but we will want to add that later. And just to get it out of the way, because I like to do that, I'm going to change a few things around to set this up as a physics object that can collide with things. So the first thing I want to change about this is I see that the center of it is kind of skewed. Like you see how it's not perfectly centered to the drink because it's centered to the asset. And so I want to take this sprite. I'm just going to click the move mode here. If I have the sprite selected, I should be able to just click left and right. And it looks like, actually I can measure this, the beer is 11 pixels wide. So we don't actually have a center on this. So we're going to have to decide what to do there. In the end, it doesn't really matter since we're going to add a collision shape. I just like it because it allows us to have things be a little more predictable if we have like a center point on it. So it's 11 pixels wide, 17 pixels tall, so we're not going to actually have a center point on it. There's always going to be like one side that has more pixels. We kind of have that as a good enough center point. I think we offset it by 1 pixel on the X, 8 pixels on top, 9 pixels on bottom, 6 pixels on the left, 5 pixels on the right, which is fine. But what really matters is adding in that collision shape. So again, I'm going to right click, add, I'm going to add a collision shape here. Since we're doing pixel art, oftentimes it's really nice. You can just make like straightforward collision shapes. I'm going to put the collision shape above the sprite so that when we're editing it, we can see what we're doing. Add a rectangle in here. We already have like vertices and everything snapping to pixels. So it's going to snap around to pixels for us, which is really, really nice. Like the zoom and the snap is really weird. So you just have to look at where the dots end up. Sometimes the blue looks a little weird. And that's our collision shape for the beer. That's going to help us determine like where the beer actually ends up. And we can make it the whole size, or we can make it, a partial, however we want to do the interactions with it. I'm just going to make it a whole shape. It's not going to matter a whole lot because like I could just make it like 1 pixel wide based on what we're going to be doing. Because what we're going to be doing is seeing how far down the bar it makes it. And even then, we might not need the collision shape itself. We might just check the like location of it and say, hey, is it centered in there? But then that leaves us up to some inaccuracies. Going through my thought process here, that's why we actually want to use the collision shape, because we want to say, is the collision shape, did it hit the target at any point in the collision shape? And so we want to make that the full collision shape of the drink, or whatever. I'm actually going to rename this to sprite 2D. When I have components of scenes, of smaller scenes, I like to just leave them as the name of the node, unless they have a specific function. So we'll go ahead and save that, save things in the playground, and look, this now is the scene that we changed. It's changed to a rigid body 2D and all of that in there because we turned that just picture into an actual scene earlier when we right-clicked it and said save branch as scene, which is really cool. It all updates for us. So over time, this playground will start to turn into a zone full of a bunch of different scenes. It's a nice way to do it, especially for this sort of mini game where it's just like a one screen sort of thing. Going back to the drink, we need to have the drink know when to go flying. Because it's a rigid body 2D, we have things like physics materials and all that. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a new physics material. We're going to turn the gravity to 0 because we don't really care for gravity at the moment. And then friction, we'll just say it has maximum friction. So that should make it slow down. We're going to get chucking some beers because this is going to be like the functional piece of the game. So we go into project settings. We're going to add some inputs. We don't have any inputs yet, but let's just add an input for chucking a beer. We'll call it slide because it's sliding down the bar. So add that, add an event, and then it's going to listen for an input. I'll just give it a left mouse click. Boom, we're good to go. So that's going to, again, just to show project settings, input map, and then you can add new action, hit the plus here for add event, and that will listen for an event on your keyboard or your mouse or whatever, and automatically assign that key press or whatever to that input. Just because we named it slide doesn't mean it's actually going to do the thing that we want it to. What we need to do is, I like to have each scene determine for itself how things go, except in this case, because we know we're going to have multiple drinks, so we don't want to put the processing of that input on the drink, or else every single drink we spawn in will process that input, and then we're just going to be sliding every beer every time we click the mouse. So what we want to do is actually go back to the playground, and since everything's going to happen on this scene, we're going to have the playground process that mouse click. So go in here, we'll attach a script. Scripts are used to do code logic. Put it in a folder called scripts. We don't have that folder, so I need to make it. There we go. So we have a playground.gd script. It's going to extend node, just means that it does everything. So control click on that to go to the documentation in the Godot editor. It can call all of the functions and has all of the properties that a node does. So the playground is a node. It extends the node, meaning it is a node and more. So it has all of these properties that you can see in the inspector on this side, as well as all the methods. So nodes and everything have a ton of different methods. It's super useful to look through the documentation. I believe this is all built into the Godot editor. It's just text and everything. I think it can all live in the executable. So I think if you're offline, you don't actually, or you can see the documentation. You don't need to be online to see it. But we'll go back to that script. So you can click on the script icon here and go back to that. Before we go any further, because we've created the drink scene and it's ready to get chucked, and we created the input and we created the playground script, before I go any further, I've done a bit of work for, what is it, 10, 20 minutes. I'm going to save everything. I'm going to push it up to the internet. We'll be right back. Coming back into handling that input for the slide action. So we created the input in project settings, add input map, add a new action, and then we recorded the input event to get that left click. Playground extends node, and there's a function in all nodes, and basically almost everything inherits from a node, so almost everything extends a node. Almost everything is a node at its core. And so what that allows us to do is use certain functions like the one to handle input. There's a function, if you control click on something like the class name like node there, we'll actually go to the documentation here, which you can use offline, which is great. It's part of the editor, but we'll scroll down and there's this function input here. This input function lets us do a bunch of stuff. There's actually a way more in-depth piece of documentation on input. We'll go to input event, and then we'll see using input event here. I already had it pulled up there. This whole piece of documentation talks about how to use the various types of input handling. I've had to reference this documentation a lot, specifically this one in a bunch of different games we've made. The input event right here is the one that we're using, which is node.input, which we got to this from that. Going back into Godot, we know that we want to use that. Quick and dirty on it is you just write function input. The underscore means that it can only be used internally to this node or this script. The underscore means that it can only be called from this node or its script. Pass in here just so that doesn't error out. That's the function we're going to use. What we're going to be processing is this event here. Every time I click a key or something like that, or an input, that's what's going to generate an input event. So we want to actually say if event dot, so the event, the input event, has functions, has methods here of is action pressed, is action released, all of that. At first glance, we would want to say is action pressed slide. But if we think about it, the point of this game is to slide the beer at a different force, a different like velocity every time. And so what we're going to do is we actually want to make that sort of for future proofing is action released, which is another method that input event has. That's going to be our if statement that says, hey, if you release the slide function or the slide input, we'll do something. In there, what we want to do, a nifty little thing you can do, it's not necessarily best practice because if the name of this changes, the reference will change as well. But quick way to get a reference for proof of concept like we're doing right now is to just drag the element in there, because we're going to be spawning multiple drinks. Later, we're going to have to figure out how to apply it to the active drink that you're sliding. But for now, it's just the one drink. We just want to see if it flies. Drink is a rigid body 2D. Rigid body 2Ds have some physics methods. We can go into the drink, see our rigid body 2D here, and go to the documentation with this button. We're already on apply impulse here because I planned ahead a little bit. If by planning ahead, I actually mean I recorded the past 10 minutes without audio by accident. When we look at the rigid body 2D, there's a ton of documentation here. It's super thorough. It's great. I read a lot of documentation as I'm doing game dev. It's super important to know how to read the documentation. If you need a skill to work on for game dev, that's definitely a skill to work on. So in this documentation for the rigid body 2D, we want to be able to apply a one-time force to the drink so that it goes flying. We could do apply force, but apply force is time dependent. And so it's meant to be applied like every physics update. So physics update like every frame, things like that. There's documentation on that, not going to go into it. But what matters right now is we actually want to use apply impulse, because we want it to be as if you just like punch the drink and it goes flying instead of like constantly pushing it. At least for this proof of concept. We're going to apply impulse here by going back into the playground script and do apply impulse. Applying this impulse, we have a few arguments in the function that it wants us to do. The impulse is going to be a vector 2. A vector 2 is essentially a directional force in this case. So the impulse here is going to be saying from 0, 0, anywhere, 0, 0 like locally to the thing that we're applying the impulse to, what direction and at what magnitude do we want this force applied? A vector 2 can also be used as a coordinate, which we'll see when we talk about the position argument here. So impulse, just as like an example, let's just make a new vector 2 on the fly that'll just kind of be used as the argument and go away. Let's just make it like 100 in the x, 0 in the y, because you can see here that it's saying like, okay, vector 2, the first spot is x, the second one is y. And like we talked about, x is going to be positive in going to the right. So we're going to apply a force to the right, and then 0, y. So we're not going to try to change where it is in the y direction. So if we go back to the script, that's what we're doing. And then we're going to leave position at 0. In theory, it should just apply the force and be good. But like we talked about earlier, the drink doesn't have a center point because the center of mass is determined by the collision shape, and our collision shape is odd numbered, and we're doing things on snapping to pixels. So we're never going to be able to find a center point here. What I expect to happen, and already had happened when I was recording without audio, was the beer will start to spin because the force is applied at a non-center position, and we'll just show this happen in practice. Also, we're going to have to set up a main scene. So let's go ahead and hit play here. Oh, the main scene was already created, but you'll have to assign a main scene when you click the play button for the first time. I just like to make it the playground at first, and then later we'll change it to the right scene that we want to use for the first one that loads when the game loads. I am clicking. I've pressed down left click, which is our slide input, and when I release it, the beer will go flying in 3, 2, 1. And it's really cool to see the beer go flying. As you could see, it rotated because we didn't have that center point impulse. Two ways that we can fix this. One way, we can bother our art person to make a centered asset, which she has done in the time that it took me to re-record this. So we do have that asset, but what I also want to show is there is the ability to put damping on things. So if you go into the rigid body 2D, you go all the way down to angular. So we're looking at a rigid body 2D, all of our angular properties. We have damping right here. So this damps the body's rotation. So any rotation that's applied to the body, it'll effectively put a drag on that. If we put 100 in here, which is the maximum value, if you drag it all the way, I'm dragging it all the way to the right. Okay, 100 isn't the maximum value, but we'll put 100 in here. We've damped at 100, and this shouldn't spin anymore. Whee! The thing with this that I expect to see, though, is if I have playground on every process frame, always print, just as like a debug thing, the velocity of our drink. Let's do our linear velocity, because linear velocity is going to be our force, not our angular velocity is going to be the rotation. The linear velocity is going to be how it's traveling across the screen, whereas angular, again, is the rotation from the center point, whereas linear is the center point moving. So we'll print that. So if I hit play here, we'll start to see all these prints of 0, 0. When I let go, we do see, if I scroll all the way back up, that it started at effectively 100, and it has very, very slight drag. We go all the way to the bottom of this here. It's slowly slowing down to 0. So that's where we can even add in the drag. We're not currently interacting with anything. So if we were interacting with a physics object, we would then add in a drag in a different way. But what we can do, since we're not like sliding across a surface with gravity and everything, we can just add linear damping. Let's say like 10. See what happens. And we let go. And man, that slowed down quick because it's slowing down like 10 every physics frame. And then we slide it again, but it's not quite what we're looking for. So this is where we might need to actually add in a surface for the beer to like slide on. We'll get to that later though. For now, we're actually going to remove that angular damping as well as that linear damping. And we're going to bring in that new asset from our art department across the room. We'll go in here, we'll fetch origin to get the latest. and then we can choose a branch to merge in. That was pushed to main, so we'll just go ahead and pull in main, and we should see our drink automatically change because that asset changed. So if I go into 2D, our beer has changed. It looks like, and I know it is because we talked about it, it is one smaller and one taller. So we got a bit of a taller stein here for the drink. So we've changed the collision shape to match that shape. And if we go in and measure things now, we've got, it is now 10 wide and 18 tall. And our collision shape is 10 by 18, and it'll have a center point. Without the damping, oh my goodness, I forgot about that. Our art department has also updated the sprites, the PNGs, for Splorsh and the patrons. So boy howdy, we've got some cowboys all of a sudden. I did not expect that. I should have, which is hilarious. And this is an example of why pushing your code up to the cloud, the internet in GitHub is really useful. I didn't have to do anything to change this. The art department across the room changed the PNGs, and those just propagated through everything. I didn't have to add them back in or anything like that. They just, boom, popped right in there. And that was an amazing little surprise. What we can do now that this just looks rootin' tootin' is we can run the project again. And because that force is going to be centered, in theory, the beer won't spin. And look at that. Beer doesn't spin because the force is centered. And that really gets us to the primary mechanic of you fling the beer down the counter. And that it looks kind of cool. It looks cool. It's kind of fun. I wish I could just keep clicking and sending more beers down the line. And that's what we're going to do next. Before we get rolling on the other parts of like making it so that every time you click, a beer is created, then when you let go, it sends it. We're going to just push everything up, and we'll be back once we do that.